Well, it is 6 p.m., so we will begin our Alumni Academy. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. My name is April Mazza. I am the Senior Director of Development for the College of Arts and Sciences. I would like to welcome you to the latest in our Alumni Academy series, Wayward, a conversation with Dana Spiotta and Jonathan Dee. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we kindly ask everyone to please mute your microphones at this time. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenters this evening. We are recording this event and it will be shared on the college's website for people to view after this evening's event. If you would not like your image to be recorded, please feel free to disable your video camera by clicking on the icon in the lower left-hand corner. Closed captioning services are provided for this event. You can adjust seeing these closed captions by clicking the caret or up arrow next to live transcript and selecting hide subtitle. If you have not already, we encourage you to please consider changing your profile name so that we can see your name. And of course, if you're an alum, your class year as well. You can do this by clicking the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your individual video screen and selecting rename. It's always nice to see everyone's names, and it will also help us to call on you if you have a question later on in the evening. We will also provide these instructions in the chat for reference. One last item before we begin. Please note, we will be opening this discussion for questions and answers at the end of the program. Now, I would like to introduce our guest for this evening. Dana Spiotta is an associate professor of English and teaches fiction in our creative writing program. She joined our SU faculty in 2009 and is the author of 5 novels. Her most recent novel, Wayward, which you will be hearing more about this evening, received great critical acclaim and was selected as a New York Times Critics' top. Professor Spiotta's books have garnered numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Academy's Rosenfeld Foundation Award, and the John Updike Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. We are also joined by Jonathan Dee, who is also an associate professor in the Department of English writing program. He is the author of 6 critically acclaimed novels, including The Privileges, which was a finalist for the 2011 Pulitzer Prize and won the St. Francis College Literary Prize and the Prix Fitzgerald. He is a former contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, a senior editor for the Paris Review, and a National Magazine Award-nominated literary critic for Harper's. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. I'm very excited for this evening's conversation. So with that, I will turn our program over to Professors Spiotta and Dee.
There we are. I hope everyone can hear me. Hi, Dana.
Hi, John. Thank you, April.
Thank you. Yes, that's really the only reason that we do this, is so that poor April has to read our resumes out loud. Thank you, everybody, for coming and welcome. Since this is an alumni gathering, we just want to start by talking a little bit about what we do here in the creative writing program. Syracuse has had one of the premier Master of Fine Arts programs in the country for a long time, long before we got here, going back at least 50 years, or going back to Stephen Crane, really, if you want to go back that far, although the MFA didn't exist then. And we're very proud to be associated with that tradition. But even in the context of that, these are really good times, honestly, lately for creative writing here. We've had a number of high-profile successes among the faculty in the publishing world, Dana among them, George Saunders, Mary Carr, our new hires, Chanel Benz and Mona Awad. And we've also had, in the past few years, a few recent graduates whose books have made a tremendous splash. Nana Ajay Brenya, for one, Anthony So. There's a forthcoming book from a student here named Monica Brashears. It's very, very good times here. And also this is, as some of you may know, the first year that at the university's behest, we've instituted an undergraduate creative writing major. So yeah, Dana, you have anything that you want to add to that or to talk about? I think sometimes it's interesting to talk about the relationship between our lives as teachers and our lives as writers, and whether those are just competing interests or whether they feed each other.
Well, I think that one of the things when I came in 2009, what struck me about the program is that all the faculty had very vibrant research lives in their creativity, in their publishing, and in their practice as artists, and they brought that to their teaching, and they took their teaching extremely seriously. And that's not true in a lot of graduate programs. It really showed me that you could teach and write, and that it actually is better for everybody if those two things work together. And I think the graduate students, who are already pretty great when they get here, we get, I think, John, we get over 400 applications, between 400 and 500 applications for 6 spots each year in fiction. So we get these great students, and then they kind of see that we're just all working and we're engaging in this learning together in this community. And now that I think it's great to have the undergraduates part of that too, with Living Writers, which is a program for the undergraduates that we teach, that is part of our MFA program. Some of the MFA students teach in it. And that, again, is a chance for them to meet living writers and understand that this is something that that isn't done by these long dead people, but are actually part of the world and the culture that they're in. So I think that's part of the reason why this program has been so successful, is that integration of creativity and practice with teaching.
Yeah, well, speaking of books still being written by living people, we're here tonight to celebrate and to discuss Wayward. And so I thought maybe before we get into it, if you wouldn't mind maybe reading a little bit from the book to give people a flavor of the voice of it.
Sure. I'm going to read from the very beginning, since then I don't have to set it up. I think the thing to know is that this book does take place in Syracuse, so I'm sure that will be obvious as I read, and it's in 2017. One way to understand, I'm just going to read for about 5 minutes. So one way to understand what had happened to her, what she had made happen, what she had insisted upon, it began with the house. It was the particular house, but it was also where the house was and where she discovered she wanted to be. It was a rundown, abandoned arts and crafts cottage in a neglected, once vibrant neighborhood in the city of Syracuse. The house sat high on a tiny lot on Highland Street, which ran atop a hill that bordered a long expanse of grass and trees. It looked like a small sloping park, but it was actually a cemetery, the old graves scattered across the rise. Unless you were squeamish about graves, Sam wasn't. The sloping green hill was quite pretty. Highland itself offered a wide view of downtown. You could see the steeples of churches, and you could see how the small city was in a valley surrounded by hills. You could even see the kidney shape of Onondaga Lake, although it was often partly obscured by low-hanging clouds. If you turned your head to the left, or if you looked out the side windows of the house, you could see Syracuse University up on another hill. You could locate it by the quilted low white bubble of the Carrier Dome, named for the nearly absent Carrier Corporation. All that remained were a handful of jobs, the Dome and Carrier Circle, a treacherous traffic roundabout that Sam hated. Soon after you spotted the Dome, you would notice the various spired and turreted campus buildings. The decision to leave her husband, the act of leaving really, began the moment she made an offer on the house. It was a Sunday, Sam woke up at 5 a.m., unable to continue sleeping. She attributed this unnecessarily early waking to the approach of menopause. Her period still came each month, but odd things had started changing in her body, even her brain. One of which was suddenly becoming awake at 5 a.m. on a Sunday, her mind shaking off sleep with unnegotiable clarity, as if she had already drunk a cup of coffee. And just as with coffee, she felt alert, an adrenal burst, but she could also feel the fatigue underneath it all, the weariness. That morning, the wood floor was cold against her bare feet, but she couldn't find her slippers. It was still dark. She tried not to wake her husband. She used her phone to illuminate the way to the bathroom. She peed, flushed, washed. She brushed her teeth without looking in the mirror. She pushed up the blinds to peek outside. The sky was gradually lightening with the dawn, and half a foot of snow had fallen overnight. It was one of those Syracuse March snow dumps. Everyone complained because it should be spring, but why say that when it was never spring in March in Syracuse? Besides, snow in March was often spectacular because of the spring light. The sunrise that was creeping up now cast a pink and gold glimmer, and a little crust of ice on top of the snow glittered from the sky and from the street lamps. The trees, the roofs of the houses, even the salt-crusted cars looked beautiful. And like most spectacularly beautiful effects, it was almost too much, too dramatic, nearly lurid. Sam loved the drama of a March snow. March meant the sky would be bright, blindingly bright, not the cloudy darkness of January or the dingy gray monotony of February, the worst month. But here was the important part. Sam figured that she was the only person on earth who thought March snowstorms were wonderful, and this made her feel a bit proud of herself. Always, she liked to imagine herself as subtly different from everyone else, enjoying the tension and mystique of being ordinary on the surface, but with a radical, original interior life. For example, back when Sam used to shop the sales at the Talbots in DeWitt with the other suburban ladies of her class and age, she separated herself. Sure, Sam had discovered that the classic A-line or sheath dresses made of solid colored pont knits were so forgiving, so flattering, that tragic word, to her grotesque midlife misshapenness, a blurriness, a squareness, really. But despite being there and shopping because of an insider email blast notification of a super sale, Sam believed that she was different from the other women. Inside, she was mocking the calibrated manipulations, mocking herself, noting the corporate branding and lifestyle implications of the preppy styles and colors. The classic plaids, the buttons on the sleeves, the ballerina flats evoking a tastefully understated sensibility. It even occurred to her that the other women could be having the same interior thoughts, and that the idea of conformity, at least in modern America, was never consciously sought after. No, Sam knew that you were sold the idea that you could be independent minded, even as you bought what everyone else bought. You were allowed to keep a vain and precious sense of agency. Her sense of resistance was as manufactured as her need to buy flattering clothing. Nevertheless, Sam also believed that her having such self-critical, self-reflexive thoughts as she shopped set her apart from the other women, surely. So she still believed herself to be, however stealthily, an eccentric person, not suited to conventions of thought or sensibility. Lately, this desire to be contrary to convention had taken on a new urgency well beyond clothes or matters of taste. An unruly, even perverse inclination animated her. It had been looking for a place to land, for something to fasten on. So now, not before, this odd inner state pushed her toward a highly destabilizing wildness, a recklessness that she couldn't suppress any longer. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's great. And that's obviously a wonderful setup for the book itself. It's always intimidating to try to describe somebody else's book while they listen to you. But I guess it's suffice to say that the house on Highland Avenue that's mentioned there, that's the thing that incites the action of the novel, is that Sam rather spontaneously, in an act that surprises even herself, falls in love with this beautiful old, neglected, decrepit, but still magnificent house, and buys it, which is an issue because she already lives in a house that has got her husband and their daughter in it. So the novel concerns not only the fallout from that act, the ramifications from it, but also just the question of, like, why did I do that? What brought Sam to that point? What does it mean? that this was in her and came out in this way that surprised her and everyone else around her. So one of the things I want to ask again, just before we get into the subject matter of the book itself, is just that, this has been a big year for you. Wayward came out in July. It's done very well, both critically and commercially, here and abroad. And that's not new for you, because you've published 4 novels before this, and they've been very successful also, but you've never published a book in this kind of world. None of us have. Normally, this is the brief period where, after the years we spend in a kind of creative solitude writing something, we go out and meet people. We encounter readers. We meet booksellers. We're in contact with our audience in a way that we often aren't. So, what's it been like? I mean, is there any way in which it's been better, or has it just been strange?
No, in some ways it has been better, in that a lot more people can participate from all over the country at any event that you do, virtual event. So I did many virtual events through bookstores and other places over the summer, and you did get to. It was really fun. Like tonight, we see to see people's comments, and I love the chat. That's always a really fun part. And but I have to say, I do really miss actually seeing people in person and being able to talk to them afterwards, and signing books and having a personal connection with people. And when I did do some in-person events in the fall, I did one at Colgate, and I did one at Albany, and I did one in Rochester. So they were local, and Syracuse too. And it felt great, because you could hear people laugh, and on Zoom you can't hear people, and so that's so I think the chat is really cool, and that is, and the fact that people can come from all over. But yeah, that personal connection where you sign the book, it's a nice part of reading, yeah. So I think it's been a mixed bag.
Yeah, you did get a quilt out of it. No?
That's true. Okay, so that's a good. I got a very nice letter. I got interesting things in the mail for this book, more than the previous books. And this very sweet elderly gentleman read the book, and he liked it. And since he's been retired, he's taken up quilting, and he lives in South Carolina. And he sent me this beautiful quilt that he made, an award-winning quilt. And it was just the cutest thing ever. Yeah, so.
Wayward, as is mentioned briefly in your reading, it starts out located pretty specifically in time. There's a scene. Somebody has their mic on. There's a scene not long after what you read that is set the night of the 2016 election. So in some ways it is about the moment, or grows out of the moment, but then it does what all of your books do, which is to actually find a way to understand that our present better by locating it just in the broader stream of American history, of American character. And by the time Wayward is done, it's actually it's gone back in time almost 150 years. So I guess I wanted to ask you about that, just in terms of process. Do these connections occur to you, and that's what inspires you to write, or do they come to you as you work? I guess it's partly a question of, about, with any novel project, what do you need to know, and what do you not need to know in order to begin?
These are all really good points. I mean, I think when I started, it was really it's much more character oriented. I don't really know what the plot's going to be, and I don't know what the structure is going to be. I have some ideas, and then as you're working, you start to bring in you might have these different ideas that you think are different books, and you realize as you're writing that all these things are connected. And so I've learned to sort of trust that the things that come up I should pay attention to. So I've had, since I moved to Syracuse, I've been very interested in the local history of Syracuse. I did a thing about the Erie Canal. I went down the Erie Canal sort of off season illegally, and wrote about it for the New York Times magazine. And that was maybe 6 years ago. and it kind of just got me sort of obsessed with how much history is apparent to you if you look for it in central New York, and in plain sight, and we sort of ignore it. Like the old canal, you can sort of, once you start noticing it everywhere, then it's everywhere, right? And the city itself has that kind of that layered effect. And it seems for me that character exists in a specific context, right? It's the time, it's the geography, it's the technology that they're using, it's as well as their identity, right? And their socioeconomic class, and all these things that shape the experience of the character. So it always becomes about the broader world, even when you're talking about specific people, because you put them in a context. And so once I decided, okay, it's going to be in Syracuse, then all of that opened up. And the election happened after I already started the book. And so I was like, that's going in the book too, because how can you write about America today and not talk about this, you know? And you remember when I was at the New York State Fair, and you saw me writing notes crazily, and I knew you were thinking, oh, she's going to put that in the book. And I was just like, this has got to go in the book. This is crazy. So, you start to be a machine of noticing for the purposes of your book. And then everything is connected. It's a little bit, if you didn't write it into a book, it would be kind of like losing your mind, because you think everything is connected and everything's speaking to your book.
Yeah, unfortunately, I understand exactly what you mean there. Yeah. So the book is located, it's not in a Syracuse-like city, but very specifically in Syracuse. And so I have a couple of questions about that. I guess one is, some of the things in the book that pertain to Syracuse or to Central New York and to its history are real, but not all of them are. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think also about where you personally, where the line might be for things that how do you incorporate made up things into a real history?
It's a good question. I mean, it's such a, it's a long-standing thing that writers do this, right? And I guess for me, the book that really hit home with how to do this was Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. I don't know if anybody remembers that book. It was a huge book in the 70s, and it kind of inaugurated this kind of the modern literary historical novel, I guess. And he would put imaginary characters with real historical figures in the same context, and you couldn't tell. In some ways, the real thing seemed more imaginary, and it made the real thing seem imaginary. It made the imaginary thing seem real. So you're kind of like stealing authenticity and spreading it out. And the reason why I do that is because the reason why I write fiction instead of writing history is that I like to make things up and have them do the thing I need them to do in the structure of the book. So I feel more at liberty if I'm using an imaginary character. So I think one of the characters in the book, who's the 19th century sort of suffragette that we hear about, and you hear from at the end of the book, she's imaginary, but a lot of people think she's real, which is I was thrilled that people thought she was real, but I had to keep clarifying that, no, I made her up. But she is inspired by real things, real people. But I didn't want to get stuck with, Matilda Jocelyn Gage is a real person, and I did borrow her house in Fayetteville for my character's house, but I made up the character because Matilda Jocelyn Gage is this perfectly respectable figure, and my person is much more flawed. So I wanted to have the liberty of really being able to play with her and not be hemmed in by the facts of any particular person. Now, Oneida, she runs off to Oneida community, which is a real place, which seems like it would be an imaginary place when you hear it described. And I love that intersection of the imaginary and the real, and the liberty you can take, because it is fiction. And even the real things that you're describing are fiction, are meant to be fictionalized. So they're not meant to be history. And I hope that people haven't lost touch with the difference between those two things, because they have different purposes. But it is all ultimately shaped by the author in this very pointed way.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Oneida, and that leads to my other question about it, is that it's Syracuse itself has a very specific and interesting history, and is also a very provocative place to be living kind of in this moment. But Central New York more broadly, I mean, you're not from here, or born and raised here. Neither am I. You grew up in California and Connecticut and New Jersey, et cetera. So what are some of the things that you have discovered about this area since you moved up here? It's really one of the kind of, it's like the breadbasket of American weirdness in some ways, and there's a lot to write about, and you get into some of that history as Wayward goes on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great book called The Stammering Century by Gilbert Seldes, and it was written at the beginning of the 20th century about the 19th century and the reformist movements. Partially because of the Erie Canal, there was a lot of activity up here. But even since then, there's always there's a lot of, maybe because there's so much land that's inexpensive, it just seems to loan itself to experiments in living. And so there were those 19th century religious movements and those perfectionist community like Oneida, but there were also lots of, back to the landers in the 70s. And there are still, and now that there's lots of Amish people that have moved to Montgomery County. There's just been, and I do love that. I love the American impulse to self-invention and that utopian impulse, even though it's almost always doesn't work out. The impulse is moving to me. I find it compelling. And I think sometimes we have this kind of, and now I'm going to say all these really general things about America, but I think we do have this kind of amnesic relationship where we just think time goes forward, and we don't look back. But of course, one of the things the book is about is that you have to kind of know where you're standing to know how to go forward. And that means looking at the history, the bad parts of the history, the things that we need to have reckonings with. And also some of these more eccentric experiments are interesting. And we have to remember that America's had a lot of revision along the way. And it just hasn't been just this one story. It's always been a place of incredible diversity, that we just need to look for it and to entertain it. So I think that's that's the part that I feel sort of tender toward, is that the kind of old weird America, as Grail Marcus calls it. Yeah.
Yeah. And Wayward's about the span of time in another way too, a way that's closer to character, which is that it's about 3 generations of women in the same family, not just Sam, but her daughter and her mother, and those relationships. You said something interesting to me a while ago about how your ability to do that has changed as time has gone on, and you've written more books. Can you say something about what that's like to be writing, from the 3 different perspectives within a tight-knit family like that?
Yeah, I think as a writer, what's interesting is when you're young, you sort of think it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what it's like to be old, right? But I always thought that you were kind of always just where you were. And what I realized as a middle-aged person is that you're still that 17-year-old, right? Like that's still in you. You remember very well what it's like to be 18, and you remember very well what it's like to be 30. And you also know what it's like to be 50 or 60. And so as a writer, I just feel that I have this kind of, I have this balance. I can see more than I was able to see when I was younger, that you are still all of those younger people within you, and you still feel what it's like to be those people, even as you age. And so I think I can start to now look forward to what's to come, and I can kind of understand more. So when I was writing these characters, when I was writing the mother who's dying, the oldest one who's dying, and the middle one is the protagonist, and then the daughter, the youngest, I felt pretty confident that I could inhabit in all directions. And I think that's maybe kind of the humbling thing about middle age, but it's also the kind of empowering thing about middle age is I do think you have just you start to get the picture on the whole finite thing of a life in a way that you just can't really feel when you're 20.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's really true, that when you're 25 and you're trying to write about a 50-year-old, it's all kind of empathy and observation. But when at my age, it's not just that I was 9 or I was 17. I still am those things. I'm always going to be those things, and you have more to call on in that way. So it's a perk of getting older. Who knew?
Oh, I just wanted to add one other thing about the Central New York and weird old America too, is that, it was, I was saying the perfectionist communities, but also, of course, the women's movement, which is a huge part of the book, and the abolitionist movement. And then also, vegetarianism, temperance. There were so many interesting ideas about how to reform the country in that time. And that energy is interesting to me. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I wanted to go back a little bit to process and to something that you said about how you begin and that you sort of have some ideas. I think, Sam, the book is in some measure about Sam becoming more aware of herself, of the world around her, of her role in it, et cetera. And since she is a credible human being, her path is not always a straight one. She has flaws, she makes mistakes, et cetera. I think sometimes people are curious how you go forward, how you make a story that lasts for hundreds of pages. Go forward and what's the ideas that you have at the beginning? Do those ideas pan out, and what do you do if they don't?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have a character, this is kind of an old, the E.M. Forrester idea, but the character wants something, right? And that want leads them to act, and that act has consequences that then leads to the next thing that happens. So I think following it from and understanding that the character is going to change by virtue of those decisions and those consequences. That's really sort of like where and to move your character towards jeopardy or towards conflict. What the fun thing about writing is it's not real. So it's much more interesting for me to write about a reckless character and to sort of be merciless in pointing out her hypocrisy and her backsliding, and because it's a way of kind of just exaggerating some impulses that I either observe or feel myself. And you can sort of think, well, what if you did blow up your life, and what if you did when you woke up in the middle of the night, you just took walks outside in the middle of the night? What would happen? And then and then how would that character react? And then what would be the next thing that would happen out of that? So it's this kind of real belief in the idea of drama coming out of sort of consequential character actions, I guess, that have to come out of like legitimate, what your sense of the character is. I mean, it always gets to kind of a woo-woo state because we're talking about a character you made up. So how can you discover what a character wants when you made it all up, right? Yeah. But so there's something in it that's I'm not quite getting at, that's a little bit more intuitive than that, right? It's just like you believe, as you're creating a character, you believe the character's real and is not you, and you can somehow kind of accompany them in this very intimate way in their consciousness. Now that's kind of, that's kind of, I don't know. That's like, you're like almost being an actor or something. You're convincing yourself that something's real that's not real. As you're working, right? And
it doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen when you write sentence one. It's something that happens kind of gradually, where they become real to you in the way they're talking about. At first, sometimes it is. You have to confront the arbitrariness of every attribute you give them.
Yes, that's so true. And then for me, it's when I get them to speak, when I hear them in dialogue, that voice sort of makes me, oh, okay, they're like this, they're like that. And that reveals things to me. But I think, you convince yourself they're real. And then you actually get to the point where you say, oh no, she would never do that,
Right.
like it doesn't pass the smell test, you know, of your own sense of that character. Right.
Right, which is, as you say, you know, arguably crazy, but yeah. All right, as we're getting toward the time, I think, when because I know we have a lot of people here, and it'll be great to hear questions from them. But before we do that, I just wanted to circle back to how we began and say that, you know, of course, like I said, this has been a banner year for you and for Wayward, but also it's been a kind of you know, record period for book sales in general, and here on campus, we see that enrollments for creative writing classes, whether these people, you know, students want to be majors or are just interested in trying it out, those are up too. There's something about the way we're living now, the things we're going through now, that's calling to something in people. What do you think that might be?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, they say that the book sales in the last year are up 38% from what they were the year before. So people are definitely reading, and obviously some of that is pandemic related, you know. But I think that the one of for me, one of the effects of the pandemic was more time online, and I do think that reading, fiction in particular, but all reading, really feels counter to the way that we interact online. You know, it's much more focused and deeper and sustained over time. And so I think when you fall into a story and you read, and you kind of get that sense of immersion, it's hard to get that in a, you know, the kind of Twitterverse of social media and the kind of you know, very horizontal data that we're getting thrown at us all the time. So I think it is kind of a countercultural technology. That's my view, that it's sort of a, you know, it resists that. As far as the students are concerned, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think there's a real desire. A lot of the students are not English majors. Some of them are, you know, almost all my workshops, I always have a, you know, a science student or someone like that, and they just want a chance to express themselves and to use their imaginations in a way. And I think what's great is they become, even if they don't become writers, most of them won't, they become better at using language, and they become better at reading. They sort of are much more sensitive to how to deploy language and how to read. And those are incredibly useful skills in anything. So I think also that. Yeah.
Yeah, and always, to me, incredibly supportive of each other in the effort to do that too. The atmosphere in those classes is always great. You've heard me tell this story before, but you reminded me again of the first undergraduate course I ever taught here. There was the introduction to, you know, the introductory fiction writing workshop, and there was, as you say, there were, you know, about half English majors and half people who were just kind of doing it because they wanted to do it. And there was a girl in that class who was studying to be a veterinarian. I'll never forget her, and she'd fulfilled all her requirements, and so she wanted to take this class because she had always liked writing, and she and her mom had written stories when she was a kid, etc. And so she just kind of, you know, wanted to give it a try. And I still think about that girl and her work, and I'm sure that wherever she is, she's a fantastic veterinarian, but you know, like kind of a the animal's gain is literature's loss. I guess the work that they do when they feel when they have that kind of form of expression available to them for the first time is often amazing.
And also just the reading, because we always make the students read a lot of fiction too, not just each other's, but
right.
Published fiction. And because the best way to learn to write is to read. It is kind of to me, reading is, as much as I like writing, reading is my first love. And so, you know, when I'm starting to get a little worn out and depressed, and I just find a great novel and start reading it, even when I've read before, I just, you know, there's nothing else that sustains you like that. And so I think that's another thing too, is it gives them something that they can very affordably access for the rest of their lives, which is, you know, this kind of reading. Yeah.
All right. Well, while we still have time, I want to open up the virtual floor to questions here. April, are you Or you-
I'm back. Thank you both so much. That was a fascinating discussion, and you've added another book to my reading list. So I'm very excited. I was looking it up to buy while you were speaking. So thank you. Couple of questions from me before I open it up, if you don't mind. You referenced book signings earlier. Do you have any other book signing schedule that we should be aware of?
Well, I mean, the book comes out in paperback in June, so I'm hoping that I'll have, definitely have some book signings. So
Fabulous. Well, thank you. Scott Maliski, class of 1995, submitted a question before this evening's event, and actually Renee touched on it as well. I just wanted to clarify, if you don't mind, what is your inspiration for writing your books? You mentioned the character, and you also mentioned the election. Renee touched on it in the chat to the point that she assumed the election was one of your prompts. Do you mind clarifying? Is the character he or she what leads you to create your work?
yeah, I mean, the house that I describe in the beginning of the book that she moves into is based on a real house, not too far from where I live. And I would walk by that house and I had this idea, what if someone, because it's so run down, and in Syracuse, you can buy a rundown house for very little money. And I thought, well, what if she just fell in love with it and bought it and didn't realize till she was driving home that she was going to move in and leave her life behind? Why would someone do that? That was my question. And then this person appeared to me that would do that. And then, and the election too, I mean, really thinking, as I said, that happened after I'd already started. And I thought, well, okay, that's part of the reason why she's upending her life. All of these things, menopause, her mother's dying, she kind of has a lot of confounding things. So I think you're writing to discover. You start with questions and you just keep reformulating the questions and asking more questions. So for me, it's always like, why would someone do that? The question drives me to the character, which then drives me to the story, if that makes any sense. It's like I'm trying to figure something out by writing about it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm not sure if you saw in the chat, but Emily Hancock expressed that she actually lived at 213 Highland Ave. So
wow. That's so the house I'm talking about, right? Yeah.
Another question from Marlene. Dana, Sam really enjoyed the Syracuse weather. Do you? It looks like this, right? Like my
yes,
background.
It looks exactly like that. I was just thinking, I wish it were March. Because no, I actually do love the winter, and I do. I wish I like it. I love the snow, and I love getting out in the snow and walking the dog in the snow. And the parks in Syracuse are so beautiful. And in the winter, you can see these incredible views from Schiller Park and Lincoln Park near my house. And nobody's ever there, and it's so peaceful and so quiet. So I do love it. The really cold part with the ice. We've had that really cold weather lately, the 6 degrees where it's really dark and cold. That gets old. But certainly Syracuse is an incredibly beautiful city, and sometimes in the winter it feels spectacular. It's true.
It's a blessing or a curse when it's been this cold and it's too cold for even the lake effect snow.
Yeah, and you can't play in it when it's this cold. It's just a little too cold. Yeah. It's not, Syracuse doesn't seem typically that cold, Yeah.
That's
more
true.
snow.
That's true. Roxanne, class of 2010, mentioned that winter is a good time to write. And I'm going to twist that into a question. Do you find that it's helpful for you to write this time of year?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the reasons why Syracuse has had success in the creative writing program, and other writers have lived here and written who aren't in the creative writing program. I mean, we've had Joyce Carol Oates and David Foster Wallace lived here for a while. I mean, there's a lot of writers that have lived here. And I think one of the reasons is that, you can stay home and write. And I tell my students that, I'm like, you come here for this program and you have 3 years and you have a lot of time to focus and write. And so, yes, I think it is good for writing. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. As Sue Cornelius Edson knows on this call, it's watching men's basketball, skiing, or writing this time of year.
Yes.
Now, Dana, what are some of your favorite books to teach? Asked by Alana, class of 2012.
I recently taught a class on research and history, and I taught a lot of new books in it. I taught The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, and I taught Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galkin, and I enjoyed teaching those. I do teach some old books as well. I teach Ulysses, a class on Ulysses, which is having its 100th anniversary this year. So I try to kind of mix it up. I think I just look for things that I want the student. I just taught an Edward P. Jones short story called The First Day, which is such a beautiful story. And I brought it into my undergrads, my freshman intro workshop. And I thought, well, this story was written in 1993. How are they going to feel about this? And I think they loved it. And I love teaching that story. It makes me cry every time I read it. And it's sort of, so I really get excited when they connect to older things. And then when I teach something very, very contemporary, I try to do both, old stuff and new stuff. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you saw in the chat, but several people commented on how much they appreciated being read to, not only this evening, but also during Orange Central. So thank you for reading to us all this evening. Marcia Klein, class of 1962, asked if you read aloud while you are writing.
Oh, that's such a good question. I do. Not while I'm writing, but when I'm reading over, I sometimes read out loud. You can, there's lots of things you have to estrange yourself from the work, and you can hear things, especially dialogue that if you're just reading silently, you can't. So I often will say things out loud, especially dialogue. I heard that Richard Ford used to read his entire novels out loud to his editor. And I was just thinking, like, his poor editor, but it is a good way to catch things. So I definitely recommend that. Wow, there's some amazing comments. I'm missing some of them, but yeah.
We'll hope to caption them for you here.
Okay.
I did want to invite Helen, class of 1960. She posted in the chat that she would like to share a trick for creative characters when she writes fiction. So we'll invite her to unmute herself and to share her thoughts with us all.
I'm a writer. I write fiction and nonfiction, and some of my books are on retiring in Costa Rica, but I've written mysteries and a book based on a scandal, or at least inspired by it. But years ago, I created a form for characters. So when I'm creating a character for fiction, I write down the name I'm giving them and everything about them, where they went to school, where they grew up. It's just a whole list. And you don't necessarily continue to use it, but it starts you in the right direction.
That's great. Yeah, I've done something similar in writing with one book in particular, writing biographies of characters that I could then go back and refer to. Yeah,
it just has been very helpful and I have a new third book in the mystery series I'm going to write after I finish my very different memoir. I've been out of Syracuse a long time, and we didn't have creative writing in the 50s. We had journalism.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So Mary Sullivan suggested there's a YouTube interview with George Saunders that you mentioned your notebooks were from Colgate Bookshop. How is that?
I have taught sometimes in the summer program at I go to they have a writers conference at Colgate, great writers conference, and I found these notebooks. They're basically lab books. I wish I was going to show you one if I had one. They're brown lab books, and I started obsessing out. And I'm very superstitious, so once I had used it and it worked for me, then I'm like, I drive to the Colgate bookstore and buy this thing. They don't have, it has to be from that bookstore. I don't know. It's just a superstitious thing. So yeah, I still do that. And yeah, I can't even, it's crazy. Okay.
I love it. I love it. All right. Jared, class of 92. Question for both of you, John and Dana. Writing is so often seen as a solitary process, but good sounding boards and community can matter just as much. Has the atmosphere of SU's program been helpful to you, and has it affected your writing?
John?
It has been helpful to me. There's as Dana was saying earlier, there's just a sense of around here that everybody's working and that everybody's very interested in each other's work, and it kind of spurs you on to you want to be part of it, and you want to write something that will make your colleagues proud, frankly. And I've taught at other places where that wasn't the case, so it's not something that automatically goes with the territory of teaching writing. But the atmosphere, when one of the people who's always set that tone here is George. But it definitely helps my work. Whether it actually changes anything in my work, I don't know. I guess probably not. But I don't know. Maybe I'm not the best judge of that. And I know that sense of as much as that sense of community and having a sounding board helps us, it's what our graduate students in particular are here for. Tenfold. I think, if you think about what their lives would be like if they didn't have that, if they weren't surrounded for a few years by a small group of dedicated people who care about the same things that they care about, it would be very, very much harder for them to get where they want to get with their art.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, I feel so, I connected to the students that have gone through the program, undergraduates and graduates, but particularly the graduates, and they stay in touch, and I have such love for them, and some of them have become really good friends, and to see them succeed in the world, it just feels, the longer I've been teaching, the more I get that experience of watching them achieve these incredible things. And it's an amazing feeling. It feels really good. And so I feel very, very lucky to be part of their experience, play one little role in it. And it's quite wonderful. And it makes you feel like you're still part of the young writer world. They keep you on your toes too, which is great. So it's been very, very good. And George Saunders is a big part of that. And when I came to my campus visit, after I did everything and he showed me around Syracuse, he took me to the Wegmans in DeWitt, and he's like, "Look at this." I was like, "I'm in." So yeah, it's a lot of very, everybody is all the faculty are very nice to each other. So that helps. Yeah.
The lives that both of you and George are impacting is quite tremendous. We're very proud of our creative writing program. So Christine, class of 16, has a comment. She was a psych and English major who took your workshop, Dana, and went on to become a therapist who actively utilizes narrative therapy, helping people create new stories of their lives for healing. So she wanted to share, to highlight how writing the power of language has made its way into her profession as a mental health clinician. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh my gosh, that's so great to hear.
Going back to that impact you have.
Yes, no, I mean, but it's so good to see that it is going on to have an impact in other ways, not just writing fiction, but yeah, I mean, this kind of narrativizing that we do all the time. That's so great.
That's very
Thank
powerful.
you, Christine. I'm proud of you.
Marlene has a question for you. Do you have a schedule for writing, Dana?
I do. As my students know, I'm kind of rigid about insisting that people have schedules. I write early in the morning, and when I'm writing, when I'm in it, when I'm not, when I'm in between books, I sometimes don't stick to that schedule. But I try to do it every day. I tell my students, try every day, and then you get, a teacher told me this, and I followed it. Go for 7 days, and then stuff comes up and you can't do it some of the days, but you still have 5 days or 4 days. And so for me, that works. It's just, you're achieving by constantly failing to meet your goals, but you're still getting somewhere.
Oh, that's great. We have a few other shout outs for Wegmans and DeWitt here in the chat. So yes, we do all love that. And if you've missed their burger bar, Erica from class of '04, there's a new burger bar there as well. Christopher references that he would love to see a badge of honor short story festival on campus. Any thoughts to that?
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Craig asks, have you ever had writer's block? And if so, how do you combat it? Great question, Craig.
That's a good one. Yeah. And I also see that Melissa in the chat has given her thumbs up to Edward P. Jones, which makes me happy. Let's see. Yeah, writer's block. To me, it's just when I finish a novel, I'm always like, oh, I'll never do that again. I'm so glad not to be writing, And then what I get, then I start just getting kind of weirdly missing it and sort of feeling sad that I'm not doing it. And then there's a little time where I will still not be doing it. And it will just, so that's my version of writer's block, is that feeling of like, I really know I need to be doing this thing that I love to do, but I'm just, it feels so like such a big thing to fall back into, another novel. So I kind of do this thing where I procrastinate that. And that's my version of writer's block. And I just have to kind of tell myself, it always feels bad in the beginning because you're feeling a little like you don't know what you're doing. And the only way to get through it is by writing. So for me, in terms of writing block, is just keep writing, even if it's bad, let it be bad, because the only way to solve it is through writing, and just reminding myself of that. The avoidance of the writing is the mistake, the not writing. Yeah.
So I have another question for you, but I suspect that was the answer. Do you have you identified what the most difficult part of the artistic process is? And I'm wondering if that is writer's block, in fact, but.
Honestly, it's all really difficult. I tell this to my students as well, which is that if you're doing it right, it just gets harder and harder. I think the challenging thing is not to think about the reception and worry too much about how pleasing other people, and just try to let it be as weird as you need it to be, and trust that it will find readers and people will get it, and not let your doubt and your self-consciousness inhibit you from doing something, taking risks, and letting your freak flag fly is what I call it. It's like just going to those weird places where interesting and sometimes it's scary because you're writing about something that makes you uncomfortable, or you maybe it's provocative or something like that. And I think you just have to take risks, and that's really hard to take a risk. And if you try to hedge your bets and to do something safe, it's not going to be good art. It's going to be boring. So just being able to take that leap, and just what I always tell myself is just, well, I'll try it out on, and I won't show it to anyone. I'll throw it away, but I'm just going to write it that way. And then I'll worry about that stuff later. So you tell yourself a little story to get yourself to be brave, I think,
All right, I'm going to ask one last question as it's 6:58 p.m. and then we'll end with a comment question first. I am listening on Audible from Dana. Do you pick the reader? And if so, how do you pick one?
That's such a good question. They gave me they gave me the reader. They said, do you like this woman? We think she'd be really good for it. This is Knopf, right? My publisher. And they gave me some clips. So I have, like with the cover, I get vetoing rights, but I don't, but beyond that, I wouldn't know what else to say. I don't know anyone they never asked me to read it, which is probably good, because the one time I had to read for the New Yorker, I had to read my story. And I apparently read kind of fast, and I stumble a lot when I speak. And it took me so long to read that story that I can't imagine how people can do a whole book. So I would leave it to the professionals, but I did get they did run it by me and I thought she was good. Is it good? I mean, it seems, I haven't listened to it, but from what I heard, she sounded like a good actress. I don't know. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I never really thought about the process for how that comes together, but thank you for sharing that. All right. So we'll end on a comment from Mary Sullivan. Mary's husband found Wayward for her at Christmas time in Memphis. She read the novel in 3 days, loved it because it brought back so many images of living in Syracuse for 10 years. You are so expressive and touching. The book remains on her bedside table with Ann Patchett's essays, These Precious Days. These days have given me so much food for thought. So
how wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful feedback.
Makes me so happy.
This has been just a fascinating conversation this evening, and we want to thank both you, John and Dana, for joining us this evening and sharing your story about Wayward. But to all of our participants for joining us this evening, we will have additional academies during the academic year, so keep an eye out for emails from the college. And again, this broadcast, if you will be available to watch again later if you'd like on our YouTube option. So thank you all for joining us, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's wonderful to see all these people. Thank you so much. I'm just trying to catch up with the comments. Thank you.
And thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.